Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee, coming to you as always live from Paris with four top correspondents. In a week that's seen nightly demonstrations taking place in Turkey, the biggest unrest there in a decade, mass street protests that have taken place in the face of a heavy government crackdown where large gatherings have been banned, social media has been limited, and almost 2,000 people have been arrested. There's also been deportation and incarceration of journalists. It follows the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, the main rival to President Erdogan in the next elections.
We came here today because there are some serious illegalities in our country. Young people have been beaten for days. We are here right now and the police are not letting us pass without covering our faces. Many politicians are being detained unlawfully in our country.
It's been a week that's exposed a huge lapse in the internal comms of the Trump administration, where the world became privy to the casual banter during the coordination of a bombing raid in Yemen. SignalGate has become known as, after journalist Jeffrey Goldberg got accidentally added to the messaging app group chat.
I mean, obviously there's two levels of telephone hygiene. One is, should you as a national security official be doing this on Signal on your phone? And then the second part is obviously the sort of ridiculous part is like, if you're gonna do it, try not to invite national security journalists.
And it's been a week of confusing, conflicting statements and setbacks for any kind of peace deal in Ukraine. On Tuesday, the White House announced it's brokered separate agreements with Moscow and Kyiv to cease hostilities in the Black Sea, aiming to ensure safe navigation. Within hours, the truce was in trouble. Meanwhile, leaders of the new coalition of the willing met in Paris to support Ukraine. Trump's key interlocutor on the conflict suggested they're all playing at being Winston Churchill.
Well, I think it's a combination of a posture and a pose and a combination of also being simplistic. I think there's this, this sort of notion of we've all got to be like Winston Churchill. Yeah. The Russians are going to march across Europe. I think that's preposterous, by the way. We have something called NATO that we did not have in World War II.
Do you think the Russians want to march across Europe?
100% not. I think.
Right? I feel like, why would they want that? I wouldn't want those countries. Like, why would they?
An old Henry Kissinger quote springs to mind. It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but it is fatal to be its friend. With me on the panel this week, four celebrated correspondents in their own fields of journalism. Joining us from Istanbul, the 3 times Pulitzer Prize nominated independent international correspondent, Burcu Dargahi. Burcu, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. What a week to have your indispensable insight. Tell us, for you, how have the last 7 days been?
I mean, it's been quite unsettling and a little bit surreal, I would say. There's, on the one hand, posters of Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul. I was on the subway today and I saw like a video ad on the subway with Ekrem İmamoğlu talking about his projects. On the other hand, he's in jail. And there's nightly protests when there are not protests. Every night at 8:30 p.m., people go out to their windows and balconies and start banging on pots and pans in a show of defiance and protest against the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu. So it's been the mood is palpable and the tension is very high.
We're going to get to also how it's affecting you and working as a journalist there as well in just a moment. Great to have you with us. From London, Nico Hines, another good friend of the programme, news director of the Daily Beast. Nico, brilliant to have your company tonight. Let me ask, are you on Signal? It is a must-be place for journalists now, isn't it?
It is, and I tell you what, I do find it quite confusing about how you add people to groups, and people have just their initials because they're trying to keep kind of OPSEC. And I tell you what, I do have some sympathy for these White House goons who have screwed this up.
Well, it's a good time for the company as well. Its founder. Let's take a look at this. This is Moxie Molenspike adding this week that you should join Signal because it includes the opportunity for the Vice President of the US to randomly add you to a group chat for coordination. So, cashing in on the moment. Great to have you, Nico. Also with us, Ana Navarro Pedro, Paris-based correspondent for Portuguese media in the studio with us. Ana, great to see you. Talk us through what you've been reporting on this week.
The talk in Portugal, it's our problems. Of course, before all the other problems, charity, starts with oneself. We're heading towards snap elections in May because the government has failed again. with some stupid, irritating, exasperating crisis of egos of politicians. So we are headed to that, and the country is absolutely fed up with it.
Not an ideal time to hold an election in the midst of worldwide
Literally
crises.
not an ideal time. We just had elections a year ago. That's enough.
Anna, great to have you with us too. Joaquim Clementi also joins us, Europe correspondent for Estonian Public Broadcasting. Good to see you, Joaquim. This is a week where you got to sit down with President Zelensky in Paris for a 45-minute interview. How was that?
I mean, I found it quite surprising that Zelensky was so lively. I mean, he was making this, you should bet on me. You know, I'm the younger man out of the two when you compare it to Putin, who was old. Zelensky was saying that Putin's going to die any day now, that we should bet on the young horse. And I think throughout the interview, he was really being sometimes quite defiant as well, because he's in a tough spot really with the US. He has to be very careful in his messaging, but I mean, I felt like he spoke the truth to us.
So it was on Bright's form. Let's take a listen to some of that conversation.
I want to come back to what you said, that you know what Vladimir Putin wants. Can you describe to the whole of Europe, what does he want? And in terms of security guarantees, we need to deter Russia. And I want to ask you, what is Putin, or who is Putin actually afraid of?
A lot of questions. Let me just give a second. I have to note them down. Who is Putin afraid of? Let me start with this. Putin is only afraid of his society. The destabilization of his society is what he's afraid of. But nobody would be able to impact that. He will impact that.
It's very interesting, an incredible backdrop for the interview as well, given the context of what we're talking about. But he managed to, what did you make of him? He managed to sit kind of, to use a Trumpian term, he does the weave quite a lot, doesn't he? Goes elsewhere, not quite answers the questions all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the question, who is Putin afraid of, is, I mean, Zelensky has said before, trying to kind of placate Trump, that Putin is afraid of you, be tough on Russia, because you're the only one who can, because the only one who really fears you is... or the only one that Putin really fears is Trump. I mean, I think it's the same view in Eastern Europe, really, sometimes, that, we need Americans here because Russia is really more afraid of America than they're afraid of Europe. So the question was really trying to get at, do we need America? But, I mean, he's trying to, find diplomatic ways to actually answer these questions as well, understandably.
We're going to look more detail as we get to the coalition of willing and to get to the state of play on the truce, or lack of it, in Ukraine as well. Joaquim, great to have you with us. We begin Istanbul, Sunday the 23rd of March, the day the city's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was due to be formally chosen as the opposition party candidate to stand as president in Turkey's next election. Almost all presidential polling had him coming out ahead of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. What happened in the 5 days before was a decision that was key to understanding the current offence around the country now, because in those 5 days he was suddenly stripped of his diploma, a diploma he graduated with 31 years ago, a complete education prerequisite to being a presidential candidate. 24 hours later, he was arrested on graft and terrorism charges. Here he is at dawn on Wednesday last week, doing his tie, explaining riot police are outside his door.
They used my beloved police officers, the security forces of this country, as an instrument of this evil, and gathered them at the gates of the residences of 16 million Istanbul residents. Hundreds of police officers did it. It is a big thing. We are facing bullying, but I want you to know that I will not give up.
The same day the protests began outside the mayor's office in support of him, calling the move politically motivated. And those demonstrations have continued every night since, in some form, as Bozu was saying, spreading across the country in defiance against the impromptu orders against mass gatherings. Hundreds jailed, which takes us back to Sunday. Ekrem İmamoğlu, formally arrested, taken into custody, suspended from duty and imprisoned, the most famous prisoner in the notorious maximum security jail, Silivri Prison. The same day his party, the CHP, confirmed they'd selected him as their candidate. In a show of solidarity, reports are that 15 million people voted for him. The instability continues this weekend with calls for the biggest protest yet. Let's begin in Istanbul. Bozu, what's the atmosphere like at the moment? And where is this heading?
Like I said, the tension is palpable. It's really not clear where it's heading. it's very difficult to discern whether the momentum will be maintained on the part of the opposition, how they will translate the street protests into any kind of effective political change in terms of the government, and whether there is a backup plan. Okay, so Imamoglu gets sentenced to jail. Is there another opposition candidate that they can present to challenge Erdogan? None of that is clear yet. I think there's a lot of confusion. A lot of the protests are being led by very energetic young people. I think there's so many dimensions to what is happening here, and I can go into so many of them. But I'll say one thing is that this move, it just further alienated Erdogan from yet another generation. A dozen years ago, you had the Gezi protests that turned into a nationwide protest against Erdogan, the protest against the dismantling of a park in central Istanbul that escalated. And that created a huge rift between a certain generation of people in Turkey and the Recep Tayyip Erdogan faction. And this is going to it's impacting. If you look at those images, it's young people, it's students, it's going to create another generation opposed to his leadership.
Tell us about him, Bartu, because there's a lot of people, a lot of his supporters say that despite increasingly draconian measures against journalists, cracking down on right to free speech, unless it's the party line, state broadcasters or whatever, your fear of saying, what we're seeing the arrest of journalists this week, but that he'd played it. He had this ethical kind of stance of what they call radical love. Tell us about how he's played that.
You're talking about Erdogan?
No, talking about Imamoglu, the way he's kind of stayed under the radar, largely up until now.
I wouldn't say, I actually have interviewed him a couple times. He hasn't stayed under the radar. He's just been, he reflects the current values of young Turkish people, this particular generation. And he's a sort of kinder, gentler, more chill politician than Erdogan. And that really appeals to, people maybe they saw this video of this Pokemon that went totally viral, this Pokemon dressed protester in Antalya in the southern city running from the cops. People love that because that's really the aesthetic of the country right now, especially among young. It's not this tough talk, this sort of harsh populism. They've had that with Erdogan for many years. And Imamoglu he smiles, he laughs, he exudes humility, even though he's quite a wily politician and has many similar attributes to Erdogan. He reflects the values of this changing society much more than Erdogan. Erdogan knows it. He saw the tide coming. He tried many different ways to prevent Imamoglu from rising. They failed. And so he had to take this very drastic step.
Yeah, his party is saying that they have had to deal with many arrests, accusations in the past, including, they say, bizarre things in years gone by in the last couple of years, including kicking the tomb of Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror, and things that they say is just to stop him. But up until now, as you say, Bartu, that he's managed to withstand. Now he's in prison. Let's have a listen to President Erdogan this week on the protests.
I believe it is worth reminding once again that the days of going out into the streets, taking left-wing organizations, extremists and vandals with you, and threatening the national will are now behind us. The days when politics and justice were directed through street terror are now completely a thing of the past, along with old Turkey.
Nico, technically, whilst we're hearing from President Erdogan, he cannot stand unless he changes the constitution. But the last few months seem to have seen him moving pieces around, moving obstacles out the way. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I fully expect to see President Erdogan in place until the day that he dies, I have to admit. There are so many pieces in play. There are so many things that have to be changed. You can see the way he has moved ruthlessly to step on Imamoglu when he looked like he might be a growing threat. When it comes to these kind of characters, they like to have a kind of image of democracy that likes to be, it's often referred to as contested authoritarianism, right? you pretend that there's an open democratic process and you go along with all of the kind of the show and all of the light that would give the idea that there's going to be an open democratic process. But then when someone actually comes up and competes and genuinely contests your right to power, then you have the clampdown. And what we've seen from Erdogan with this kind of absolutely ridiculous kind of loophole of taking away this guy's degree in order to stop him running against him is that even though Erdogan is fully aware that everyone in the country is going to know exactly what he's up to, he is willing to take that risk because he knows that ultimately he still controls the three kind of pillars of democracy in Turkey. You know, he's got the executive power, he's got the legislative power, he's got the judiciary, all willing to go along with him. And there's nothing that's going to stop him from enforcing his own power. So, you know, I think it's great to see kind of these protests, and it's very impressive. And, you know, this image of Pikachu running away from the cops will definitely become one of the iconic images of kind of anti-authoritarian democracy. But I don't see many kind of signs or glimmers of hope that Erdogan's power is going to be checked anytime soon.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Nico. Joachim, when we look around and look for the international reaction, what are you finding, what are you hearing in Brussels? How loud is it?
No, very quiet, very quiet. I mean, I think the EU is really turning a blind spot to what's happening in Turkey. And I mean, it's quite obvious that this just speaks to the fact that the era of European soft power is just dead and buried. I mean, there's no way to influence Turkey. I mean, the EU is so dependent on Turkey in terms of controlling migration inflows, in terms of what's happening on the Black Sea and what's happening with Ukraine, in so many ways. That the EU just can't afford to really speak up. They don't really have anything other than to say that Turkey has to respect democracy, but that's the statement they've made. But going further than this, to maybe stop some of the aid inflows to Turkey, which they are getting from the European Union, they're not doing that because Erdogan realizes that the geopolitical situation is such that nobody's going to call him out for what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to Joachim, I think it speaks of his position, President Erdogan, on a world stage. Those points added to the fact also right now NATO, I should say the coalition of the willing, want to use him to be part of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. He's very useful for many different countries.
And he plays on so many tables and so many boards. I don't know if one of these days that is going to turn against him, but for the time being, no. For the time being, Europe tried to call him out a little bit, but as you said, nothing to upset him. He's on good terms with Trump. He had a good phone call with President Trump. Putin has his back. He had a very big victory in Syria with the fundamentalist, the ISIS, Al-Qaeda chief now running Syria. And Erdogan already started having some problems, but he had his way. He's having his way with the Kurdish as well. So why not try to put a rival away, the one who could really maybe be an adversary, a serious adversary, the mayor of Istanbul. This is the time. The demonstrations, the protests, as it was said before, he will wait for them to wither off, as I might say, most representative democracies in the world. There is no demonstration on the street that can bend the policy of any government. As for any democracy, be it in Europe or in North America. So he's not far away from what is happening elsewhere. So he's also, as you said, he played his hand immediately with the European Union. Okay, with the coalition of the willings. Okay, you want our soldiers, we have many, they are very good, not like yours that are not so extraordinary. We have a good army. If you want us to go into Ukraine, as peacekeeping forces, you give us entry to European Union. I don't know where he pulled it out of his sleeve, but he pulled it out again. He's on the fence with the BRICS, so he's really playing with a lot of opposite cards. Let's see which one will stay. But I mean, all the neo-Ottomans around him are not willing to give up their project of the Ottoman Empire. Somehow the Ottoman Empire redacted. I don't know. I see Bozo is smiling. Maybe he doesn't agree with me. But so maybe he will choose a dolphin now and someone who will pursue his plans.
Let me pick up with Bozo, because I also want to know, just on what Anna was saying, also just what it's like for you personally covering this, talking about this, knowing the clampdown. We've seen journalists being captured, being arrested, some being deported as well. What's your take?
I mean, my background is working in authoritarian states. I mean, I've worked in Iran, I've worked in Egypt after the coup. So it's not that unusual for me, and I know how to handle myself. But I think that the bigger problem and the bigger pressure is on the Turkish journalists, those who've been arrested, including those who work for Western agencies. The BBC's Mark Lowen was deported from the country, allegedly for not having press credentials. He was a longtime correspondent here. So I think that the Turkish journalists who are here are the ones that are really feeling the pressure and the potential threats against their families, against their livelihoods, and they don't have the luxury of getting on a plane and getting out.
Well, it was great to hear from you on that tonight. Let's take you to issues elsewhere, because the 24th of March is an interesting day, historically speaking. It was the 24th of March, 1603, King James ascended to the English throne, united the crowns of Scotland and England. The 24th of March, 1882, is when German scientist Robert Koch discovered the bacterium that causes tuberculosis. Now we can add to Wikipedia that it's the day in 2025 that SignalGate emerged. How it's recorded in history depends on what happens next, but it might at least be the first documented use of emojis describing the bombing of a country by a top US official. Now, after creating a group on the Signal app called Houthi PC Small Group, Mike Waltz reacted to the strikes on Houthi targets with the emoji combo of a fist, flag and fire, plus some casual banter, brought to us by Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic magazine, who'd accidentally been looped in. This is a segment of what went down, courtesy of The Atlantic, talking about if you think we should do it, let's go. I hate bailing out Europe again, says JDV. We assume is JD Vance. Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, is saying, I fully share your loathing of European freeloaders. It is pathetic. Well, the news broke. President Trump claimed he knew nothing of it. He said he'd take a look at it, then called it a witch hunt and said it's likely to have been a low-level assistant who accidentally added a journalist. But an hour earlier, Mike Waltz had told Fox News he did it, no one else. He called it embarrassing and quoted, this guy got sucked into this group. Let's take a listen.
It's embarrassing, yes. We're going to get to the bottom of it. I just talked to Elon on the way here. We've got the best technical minds looking at how this happened. But I can tell you for 100%, I don't know this guy. I know him by his horrible reputation, and he really is the bottom scum of journalists. And I know him in the sense that he hates the president, but I don't text him. He wasn't on my phone, and we're going to figure out how this happened.
So you don't know.
So we've had different responses from different members in that group in the government. Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth blaming the journalists, called it a hoax. Nobody texted war plans, he said. JD Vance said the story had been oversold, overblown. Marco Rubio said clearly it was a big mistake. And then the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said the info wasn't classified. It didn't compromise the intelligence community. So Jeffrey Goldberg, back to him, the Atlantic editor, at first had been at pains to redact any potentially sensitive classified data in the first leak, decided to send the full details of the conversation, including the attack plans. Let's take a look. So we see the times to which the drones, to which the aircraft, the F-18s, went in the air, and the times that they were due to strike as well. Nico, does Signal deserve its gatehood?
Well, it's certainly an example of something that the administration has done, which is just so stupid that I think it will have a lasting impact on their reputation. Obviously, the scandal in itself of allowing this information to leak ahead of the attacks had absolutely zero impact whatsoever, because the journalist in question decided not to publish any of the information until after the attacks had taken place. So in that sense, it's a nothing burger. But what this is an incredible insight into the workings and the thought processes of the very most powerful people in the world. I think the clips that we've just listened to are incredibly illuminating. It's like, why is Mike Waltz, having made this mistake, everybody can empathise and can understand with how you can accidentally, presumably he was trying to add somebody else called Jeffrey or somebody else who had similar initials and he accidentally clicked the wrong name. It's something that anybody could understand, anybody's done. The idea that he's then going to lie to the TV camera and say that this guy's name was not in his phone is just so ludicrous as to be just stupid. Of course, Jeffrey Goldberg's name must have been in his phone, otherwise he wouldn't have accidentally clicked on that name. It's completely self-evident. And then you've got Hegseth saying there was nothing classified in this thing. Anybody knows that to give the precise details of a coordinated attack being launched by different vehicles in the coming hours against a foreign adversary is obviously classified. So it just raises the question once again of how can these people be so dumb, and how can their lies be so obvious? I think sometimes we want to ascribe to them a kind of like Machiavellian thought power, like they're gaslighting the nation so as to show off their credentials. But when you actually see them talking amongst themselves, you realise that the truth is much less impressive, and that these are not impressive intellects. These are not geniuses. Unfortunately, they are the people running the most powerful country on earth. Very interesting.
Joachim, when we listen to the excuse or the reason given by the team, by Mike Waltz, saying, it's going to have to be Elon Musk looking into this. We need the department to look at it. He'll get back to us. Notably, Elon Musk wasn't actually in this group.
I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, who is Elon Musk really? He's a CEO of some tech companies, but he's not a technical expert. I mean, the idea that he would be doing some sort of investigation that would get to the bottom of, the interworkings of Signal. I mean, as my colleague was saying, I mean, it's quite clear. It's just, finger press in the wrong direction. I don't know what there is to investigate. I don't think there's any sort of real doubt as to the fact that it's just a human mistake. We can't forget that these world leaders, as we see from the chat, are just normal people who chat in emojis sometimes. It's just quite shocking, really, that they have these conversations with such carelessness. In these apps, when they have perfectly good systems where they can communicate secretly, when they keep their thoughts about Europe to themselves and they don't cause diplomatic incidents. But unfortunately, they are behaving like school children, really.
Bozu, the one point that's worth raising is, aren't there questions about this de facto app? It seems being used for the Trump cabinet. What else is being used, if not just for this group, up until this point, this use of an unapproved platform for sensitive comms, to which brings us to the fact that when this was being used, we know that the key interlocutor on Ukraine, Steve Witkoff, was in Moscow. Now, we don't know what happened. We're assuming that he hadn't added to the group, but it gives you a sense of, consequences of a potential breach, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly a major intelligence failure by the Republicans' own criteria. Viewers may recall the just intense amount of hearings that the Republicans launched when it came about, Hillary Clinton using her regular email account to discuss government matters, not necessarily even secret matters, and just how many weeks of intense investigation there was, how much they made a big deal about every time that there was files that Biden apparently had taken home. So these guys are basically hypocrites. They were the first to pounce when there was, any hint of a intelligence failure or a security failure on the part of the others, and then this huge major failure. Absolutely. You're talking about a military operation the key word is in real time. You're not talking about planning for something weeks in advance. You're talking about things that are going on right now. Kabam, the little boom emoji when the strikes happened. This is clearly very sensitive operational information. The fact that no one on that list said, hey, maybe we should be using one of our proprietary security platforms that we've paid billions of dollars for the Pentagon and for other agencies, and not using a commercial app for this. Completely inappropriate, completely scandal-worthy. And the Democrats, if they're worth their salt, they will pounce and pounce hard.
Well, let's take a listen to Jeff Goldberg this week, who's spent his week being accused of being a sleazebag, a low-life clown as well by Trump and co. This was his take, talking to the BBC.
There's a widespread feeling in the White House that Mike Waltz is an idiot. That's the word that's been being used. And that there are a lot of people in the system, in the national security system, who can't believe that he had, let's call it such poor telephone hygiene as to do this. And I mean, obviously, there's two levels of telephone hygiene. One is, should you as a national security official be doing this on Signal on your phone? And then the second part is obviously the sort of ridiculous part is like, if you're gonna do it, try not to invite national security journalists.
Anna, here's the thing. There are some journalists scratching their heads because Jeff Goldberg left the group after this information and left them to it. There are some saying, why didn't you stay in there? Why didn't you expose potentially more details further down the track? Would you have stayed in?
I would have stayed if it was if I could. But I mean, at one point, if you want to reveal what was going on, you have to pull out, of course. Otherwise, I would also see immediately a lawyer to make sure that I couldn't be prosecuted. But the thing is, and I think both who talked about it, the thing is, how come these powerful people are using Signal, to exchange confidential information? They all of them belong to this committee called Committee of Principles that when they have a meeting is in a very secure room, they can't have their phones with them and so forth. And now they are just, exchanging. There are some series now, one of them in a platform called The Diplomat. And you see the language that the actors or are using, and the low quality of exchanges. And I thought, this is a poor series. No, it reflects what's going on. That's the worst part of it. And on top of it, of course, they've probably used Signal, that would be my bet, if I had to bet, in order to kiss the ring of the boss, Mr. Trump, who owns Signal. But, that's incredibly really, how do you say, léger, it's incredibly stupid and dumb. But on top of it, where are all the other officials? Where are the assistants? Where are all the security people who are supposed also to have a look into it? Why nobody's saying anything? It looks like a bunch of high school students, the ones who are the most important in school, that no one dares to dare. And it seems so irrelevant, but it's good for us Europeans because, it gives us a little momentum right now.
Well, we see. It's owned by Moxie Marlinspike. I mentioned him before. He was seen as previously an anarchist, somebody who runs counter to politics, but clearly is seen as secure enough to be the app of choice. You wanted to pick up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this point about school children. Really, it's so interesting watching J.D. Vance immediately go to the Europeans. We should be thinking about what's the European reaction going to be like. Will they see it as the U.S.
That was in another time. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, but again, it's just kind of like school children, is will this guy be at the party, what will they think of our action? Instead of actually talking about, what's this going to mean for American policy, they're immediately going to Europe. And the question also about, it's clear from these texts that the Trump administration sees American military power as a protection racket. They want money for this. They want money for Europeans. And I don't recall anybody from Europe really asking them to do this, what they were doing there. So it's like a mafia gang or something. It's quite
briefly. May I add something? There is another thing. Right now, the bombers, B-2s, the stealth bombers, nuclear bombers, are gathering up in Diego Garcia base. And there are 6 or 7 of them already out of 18, a fleet of 18, I believe. There is wide speculation in military publications about what is it for. Is it for attacking Yemen? Is it for attacking Iran? Does it mean that we are on the eve of United States attacking Iran, maybe with nuclear bombs or not? So there is a lot of speculation in the military open publications. And the question is, why is it so open as well? Is it another monumental cock-up? Or, sorry, pardon my French, or is it wanted to be seen and so to have some impact on what is going on also in the Middle East?
Well, Elon Musk will tell us very soon he's investigating. Well, let's take us to Thursday and Paris in the springtime on the steps of the Élysée Palace. President Macron's meet and greet with the leaders and prospective members of the Coalition of the Willing. A who's in, who's out session. Around 30 European countries, plus Canada, Australia, Turkey, meeting to work out how to help Ukraine secure itself against Russian threats in the event of a ceasefire. The centre, Anglo-French proposal of sending a so-called reassurance force, peacekeepers who can respond if attacked by Russia, according to the French president. Such countries such as Australia, Turkey, the Baltic states, Finland, appear to be committed, while others, Italy, Poland, Spain, are not up for it, favouring political, logistical support instead. Let's take a listen to President Macron.
These reassurance forces, part of the Franco-British proposal from several weeks ago, are not intended to be peacekeeping forces. I clarified this point in response to one of your colleagues yesterday. They are not meant to be forces stationed on the front lines or forces that replace the Ukrainian army. Instead, they would consist of troops from certain member states, not all, as some do not have the capacity or the political conditions to do so. However, these forces would be deployed in strategically pre-identified locations with the Ukrainians, providing long-term support, European reassurance, and serving as a deterrent against potential Russian aggression.
It's not certain what use this force will be. The White House doesn't like the idea. It's been made clear by President Trump's key interlocutor, Steve Witkoff. We heard from him earlier, and he dismissed Europeans trying to play the hero, he said, in an interview last weekend.
What the hell is going on with European? Like Keir Starmer saying we're going to send British troops. Their entire military is smaller than the U.S. Marine Corps. The country is dying economically. All those countries are dying economically. Like, what are they thinking? What is that? Is that a posture? Is it a pose?
Well, I think it's a combination of a posture and a pose, and a combination of also being simplistic. I think there's this, this sort of notion of we've all got to be like Winston Churchill. The Russians are going to march across Europe. I think that's preposterous, by the way. We have something called NATO.
Well, secondly, a truce seems further away this week than it did the week before to many. The latest round of US-Ukraine, US-Russia truce talks in Saudi Arabia saw the White House announce a breakthrough on a specific ceasefire just for the Black Sea to allow freedom of shipping. Hours later, it was evident that attacks on Ukraine's ports hadn't stopped. Moscow then added new conditions, saying Europe must first end sanctions on Russia's banks. The EU said for that to happen, Russian troops must first leave Ukraine. Bozu, let's first focus on the coalition of the willing. This is something President Zelensky is clearly committed to, but it's irked the US, who are vocal about it. What's your take?
I think it's a positive step for European security. The Europeans are stepping up. They're finally recognizing that there has been a change in Washington, that the post-World War II assumptions that have been held by governments in NATO and Europe are no longer valid, and they have to, fend for themselves, so to speak. I think that the U.S. is upset by this development merely because it interferes with their attempts to pressure Ukraine into giving the Trump administration economic concessions and, winning the favor of Moscow, which seems to be very important to Donald Trump. But I think that they are mistaken if they think they can position troops in Ukrainian areas and not have Russians attack them. I think that that's just fantasy. I think that given Russia's history going back, hundreds of years. And our friend from Estonia is probably a better analyst on this. But I've also studied Russian history, and nothing has ever stopped them from pursuing a war except victory or defeat. That's the sad truth about Russia and its geopolitical methods.
Joaquin, let's bring you in at this point. I do want to listen to another part of your conversation with President Zelensky. This is what he said to you on Wednesday night.
The people in my country and our neighboring countries are worried. We have historical examples of the big powers selling us out, making deals over our heads, deciding our freedoms and independence without our knowledge. A lot of people are worried that this is what's happening again. Is it?
Well, let's just believe it's not so.
Went on to weave a little bit from answering your question directly. Do you feel, I think you talked about not quite getting all the answers to your questions. Diplomatically, it's in a tricky position, I guess. But what was your sense of President Zelensky's mood on air and off air, and how different are the two from the time you had with him?
I mean, we didn't really have a lot of time. He was late to come because of the Elysee and had to rush off the dinner with Macron. But it is a tough question to answer. I mean, I think he was very emotional in answering this question because, I'm talking about my country, Estonia, from the last century with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, for example, of these deals being made over our heads. But for Zelensky, his country experienced the same thing. But now he's in a position where, Europe is not at this table, but in a little way, Ukraine is. So, the question is also about, will Ukraine kind of be this voice to stand up for all the other European countries as well if they're struggling to make their way to the table? And I think Zelensky was trying to say that, have confidence in me, I am smart enough to see if I'm trying to be, if Trump will betray me. But he's being very diplomatic right now, and the bet from him right now really is that Ukraine is agreeing to anything the Americans are offering within reason in terms of these ceasefires. And he's trying to prove to the Americans, to the world, that Ukraine is ready for peace. It's Russia who's holding it back, and he's giving this time for Trump to actually make his word true, which he has said before, that he will be tough on Russia. That's what Zelensky is asking for. That's the point he's making. But it's the moment of truth happening right now. Will Trump be tough on Russia, actually?
Separately, I want to bring Anna and Nico in for the last 30 seconds each on this, starting with you, Anna, then Nico, because also this week, and Joaquin will be very aware of this from in the Baltic states, the European Commission brought out this preparedness strategy aiming to make society more resilient to the shocks of war and other crises, a stockpile idea of 72 hours worth of food just in case. Do you have that, and what do you make of it?
Well, those recommendations have been going on in NATO countries for over a year now. It's an 80-page document. I noticed on the third page, usually they talk about expropriation of goods and savings of people if necessary for the war effort. So let's be cautious about it. Yeah, of course, 72 hours is nothing if there is a war. The thing is preparing people slowly for, conditioning people slowly for maybe something wider going on. But Europe is out of the game. They want to keep the war going on in Ukraine, and they explain why. Washington wants a peace deal and wants to go on to other objectives in the world, maybe divide international relations with China and Russia for some near future. We're not sure about it. And both Putin and Trump want to get rid of Zelensky because he seems to be the biggest obstacle to some smooth peace deal that will not be good for Ukraine and for the rest of us.
Nico, 30 seconds. How seriously are your fellow countrymen taking the idea of stockpiling 72 hours worth of food and crises plans?
Well, I'm not sure about stockpiling the food, but, are we confident that Trump is going to stand up to Russia, as Joaquin was just answering? No, we're not. And unfortunately, as much as I'd love to finish on an upbeat note here, are we reassured by Macron's, Starmer's reassurance forces? Sadly, no, we are not.
Well, Nico, a delight to have you, even on that note. Thank you to my guests, as always, bringing unique insight and clarity when it is most needed. Pulitzer Prize-nominated independent correspondent Borzu Daragahi in Istanbul. Thank you, Borzu. Thank you, Nico Hines in London, news director for the Daily Beast, Paris correspondent for Portuguese media, Anna Navarro-Pedra. And thank you, Anna, and thank you, Joaquim Clementi, Europe correspondent too, for Estonian Public Broadcasting. Thank you all. And if you're watching us live or listening back online, thank you. This month we've been included in the top 100 podcasts around the world for current affairs. So, from one global phenomenon to another, Netflix's record-breaking Adolescence was only released 11 days ago. It's been streamed more than 66 million times. Its focus is in the online radicalisation of teenage boys in the so-called manosphere, leading to violence against girls. Raised in the UK Parliament this week too as a potential catalyst for change on the online content children should access. Here's a flavour of it. See you in 7 days for The World Next Week.
You're not getting it.
What am I not getting?
Dad, you're not reading what they're doing. It's a call to action by the manosphere. 80% of women are attracted to 20% of men. You must trick them because you'll never get them in a normal way.
We've done nothing wrong, have we? It's crazy what your brain tells you to do when you're a kid.